We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
The whole notion of logic.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second. Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious. What is this nothing you talk about? What is this nothing you talk about?
With your permission, sir?
Permission granted.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage!
Engage. 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 Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. 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 Engage forward shields 35%. Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Welcome to TR News, your home for transnational rationale. Join today's trek through the stars illuminated from the proverbial oil of a blessed olive tree, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Truth guides its purveyors to the light, and truth derived from the reason is omniscient. I'm your telepathic rhetorician, and this is today's world news. How are sanctions and blockade affecting humanitarian effort in Syria? This is by Sarah Saloom. This is an article from Al Mayadeen. With thousands dead and thousands of others injured in Syria due to the earthquake, numerous international cargo companies refuse to land in Syria out of fear of U.S. and EU sanctions. How are sanctions blockade affecting humanitarian efforts in Syria? This massive earthquake a few days ago was a 7.8 Richter measurement or magnitude. It ripped through Syria on early Monday, leading to hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries, with the latest tally showing more than 1,600 people have been killed in the catastrophe-stricken country. So that excludes Turkey. The Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has called on the United Nations and competent UN organizations, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, among many other humanitarian organizations, to provide help for the country in the face of the devastating disaster Syria has been hit with. Here's the rub. Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad held a meeting with UN representatives and various NGOs in a bid to explain the impact of the unilateral sanctions that are drastically affecting the situation in the country and the humanitarian response to it. Local sources told Al Mayadeen that numerous international shipping firms have refused to land in Syria out of fear of U.S. and EU sanctions after several countries have asked Syrian airline companies to transport tons of aid aboard their civilian airliners, which are not properly equipped for transporting such large amounts of aid. The unjust sanctions on Syria directly contributed to an increase in the number of victims as a result of the earthquake because of the inability to secure modern machinery and equipment used in such instances. The head of the fire department in Latakia, Lieutenant Colonel Mohanad Jafar, told Al Mayadeen, "We fulfilled our duty as per the capabilities available to us. Our entire regiment with all its firemen is on high alert. Rescue operations are still ongoing, but we're taking more time because we don't have the proper equipment or a sufficient number of vehicles. Were we to have these capabilities, we have been able to save more lives." Social media users have been sharing a screenshot from live flight trackers showing how Turkey's airspace is full of air traffic, while neighboring Syria to the south does not have any air traffic whatsoever, signaling how the whole world was quick to send aid to Turkey in stark contrast with the situation in Syria. Some sources have revealed that so far, some 62 aid teams from 50 countries have made it into Turkey, while barely any have made it into Syria. Yeah, so there are some other ways of thinking about this, and I'm going to get a quick timestamp. Let me, just for a moment, retrieve some data.
Briefly. And in Syria. So yesterday we reported the death toll as being, I believe, 1,900. Today, the death toll for the earthquake is up to 4,000. And that is based on this morning. According to Turkish authorities, over 3,400 people were killed and over 21,000.
This is Jamal Thomas of a Sputnik radio station or radio show entitled Fault Lines.
Were injured. The country's disaster management officials also said 6,000 buildings were destroyed. And again, that is not just Turkey, that is also Syria. And if you remember, Syria has been under sanctions, not to mention war, for so many years. You can imagine the damage that has taken place there and the inability for them to actually rebuild after that particular earthquake. To have a conversation about it, we're joined with Elijah Magnier. He's a veteran war correspondent. Elijah, welcome to the show, my man. How you doing this morning?
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm fine, thank you.
Could you go into that for us? This is disastrous, to put it mildly. It's catastrophic.
And Elijah Magnier is known for his Orientalist oriented reporting.
And on some level, I think people need to realize that, after the war, Syria had, 500,000 people basically died with Obama trying to have a regime change in that country. The sanctions that were put on during and after that prevented the country from rebuilding itself, the theft of oil in the country itself. And now you have this earthquake. What is the plight of Syria after this earthquake? Can you give us an idea of what is it like on the ground and what are the expectations going forward in regards to trying to rebuild?
This is a very good question. Actually, during the war and including in the last earthquake, we have 38 hospitals completely destroyed and 700 doctors that have been killed in Syria. So we have the Caesar Act, that is the sanctions imposed by the United States and Europe over Syria. That is very important. Doesn't include natural disaster and humanitarian aid that have been excluded from Syria since yesterday, because Syria has been hit as Turkey, not as much. Still in Syria, there are 1,624 people who are.
Yeah, what is the purpose of denying the people humanitarian aid? Is the point that a lot of outlets have been making. And the idea that, okay, Syria, the West is creating the narrative that Syria is somehow humanitarianly decrepit in a way. And the idea that it's a tit for tat, wherein the people who are part of the country are responsible or even taking the onus or privy to being affected by the manifestations of the back and forth between Western countries and Syria.
Killed, and there are around 4,000 wounded, but the government estimate an equal number of people still under the debris because they don't have the means to remove the debris and to support the population. Only few countries, you have 6 or 7 countries like Russia, China, Iran, Iraq, Algeria, Tunisia, and the Emirates who rush to help Syria. The problem is all the other countries feel afraid for the American sanctions because they were told that any flight that land in Damascus means violation of the US and EU sanctions. So even if there are harsh sanctions against Syria, the aim is to hit the population, allow them to remain under the debris, showing how we are really not looking at support of the population. So at the end of the day, why these sanctions have been put forward? To help the population get rid of President Assad? Well, I don't think this is the way we are helping the population. I don't think this is the way the Americans and the European governments are supporting the Syrian population. On the contrary, neither in the area under the control of President Assad, nor the area under the control of the jihadists and the rebels who have direct access from Turkey, direct access of the Americans who still occupy northeast Syria They can go, as United Nations approved just 20 days ago, the return of the humanitarian support to the areas that are outside the control of the Syrian government. And yet all the friends of Syria that pretend to be the friend of Syria, i.e. Europe and the United States, are not helping the Syrian, even in the area under the rebel and the jihadist control. So what we have here in Syria, we have a very bad weather, we have the snow, you have only Iran that is supplying Syria with oil once a month, and that is not enough for the necessity and the need of the country, because the real source of oil comes from northeast Syria that is occupied by the American, and that the President Donald Trump said, I want to take, and President Joe Biden just follows the same policy. So this is the tragedy that we have in Syria today. There are 74 countries supporting Turkey that is used to this kind of disaster, but it doesn't mean they shouldn't. On the contrary, this is very good to support Turkey. However, when we have 34 countries in Turkey and we have only 6 or 7 in Syria, there is something fundamentally wrong here in relation to how people and countries support each other in facing natural disaster.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence. We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Yeah. So I mean, and this is a quantitative analysis as well, right? 34 countries, and in the last article we just read here, not only are those 34 countries there, but there's a ton of flight information that's saying, hey, there's air traffic all throughout Turkey, but somehow, it's not, there's a direct reason why, and that's the focus of this segment, is the sanctions themselves, right? Yeah, I wanted to name this section Syrian Sanctions Lifted as a question, but I thought, might that be misinformation or disinformation, even though it's a question? But yeah, I do think we should be optimistic about this, like me not covering the drastic nature of the hurricane, the earthquake, its debris, etc. That's important, but at a certain point, we're going to have to move away from the gawking of the natural disaster and begin to focus on real, tangible solutions.
Wow. I mean, from the standpoint of Turkey, how are they going to grapple with this? I mean, granted, they don't have to deal with the sanctions and everything else that Syria has had, and their country hasn't been destroyed with war. But with the number of deaths and everything else, how is the rescue effort?
Yeah, so that gets further into Syria. There may be Turkey. There may be some more on that. I may come back to it, but this is another outlook here. This is The Hill. Brianna Joy Gray and Robbie Suave. This is an interesting take because these two pundits are supposedly ideologically opposed to one another, but you'll find, by way of what happened with, let's say, a Matt Gaetz and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez during the House hearings on electing a leader, it might be true that the center-right is further away from the progressive left than the progressive right, or the, let's say, far right.
A powerful earthquake has left more than 5,000 people dead and tens of thousands injured throughout Turkey and Syria.
Yes, and Brianna Joy Gray would represent in this instance the left, and or for that example, the left, and Suave, the right.
After the quake struck yesterday. The earthquake is one of the strongest to hit the region in more than 100 years, CNN reports, and it struck 23 kilometers east of Nuraji in Turkey's Gaziantep province. This footage shows part of the damage the quake left in Turkey.
The United States Agency for International Development said it was deploying 2 specialized search and rescue teams as part of the American response to these deadly events. The 2 units are based in Virginia and in California. They're the only...
Note, where does it say they're deploying them to? It says they're deploying them to Turkey, right? And, you know, maybe further investigation might lend itself to us figuring out whether or not that aid is going to Turkey and Syria, but it's definitely going to Turkey, as you see in these headlines, and you can hear it in the sentiment of the people, right? There's not much advocacy for Syria, not as much as Turkey. So that disparity is one of those things that probably slows the hope that the humanitarian aid blockades will be lifted.
Such teams in the U.S. that work internationally, the New York Times reports.
Meanwhile, host of Pushback on the Gray Zone, Aaron Mate, tweeted yesterday, Syria has suffered a devastating earthquake. This war-ravaged country is under crippling U.S. sanctions. This tweet is in response to what senior U.S. officials Dana Stroll said about Syria in 2019.
The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
The Middle East Council of Churches called for the immediate lifting of Western-imposed sanctions on Syria, as the current blockage is restricting efforts to provide the Syrian people with help in response to the quake. The council said in a statement, "We urge the immediate lifting of sanctions on Syria and allowing access to all materials so that sanctions may not turn into a crime against humanity." What a monstrous thing that official said. This is a moment of desperation for the people of Syria, that they're suffering.
Well, that was an older quote. That was a pre-earthquake quote. But celebrating the idea that the country through civil war has been reduced to rubble.
I mean, it's the same basic principle.
Exactly, and that's what Aaron Mate is, pointing out here, that suddenly in the face of a kind of act of God, it might become more obvious to people that it's wrong to be rooting for a country to be devastated the way that Syria has been devastated. I think, something like 90% of the country is living in poverty. They've been dealing with famine. Obviously, through just bombing and strife, the country has been decimated even before this. But to be rooting for it in a political war context, but not, but to suddenly realize that the human gravity of it in the earthquake context.
They're rooting for it because they want regime change in the government.
Phasers locked. That was precise, right? This juxtaposition between, humanity and war and deprivation. Now, where are we as a human species?
Right.
But is there any evidence that this kind of sanctions policy is helping further the goal? Let's say in an ideal world, that would be great if we could swap out Assad with some preferable government. Now we know that in the real world that is a very fraught proposition, and that we've forced
no one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Where's the evidence? You have it. Where is it?
These swaps in the past, and they've not always worked out great. But is it weakening him as the people die and suffer? Does it actually weaken the authoritarian government. I think time and time again we find out that immiserating the country, harming, killing, starving, destroying the people does not actually put them in a position to be prepared to demand.
The evidence, we heard the evidence, we saw the evidence. We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
No one can dispute the evidence.
Changes of their government.
Right.
In fact, it makes them more desperate for their government to provide for them. They're more reliant on the government because we've closed them off from the rest of the world as they're dying.
Yeah, so this is another one of those situations in Syria where we're doing these kind of proxy wars with Russia. And there have been critiques from people like the World Food Organization about the fact that the sanctions have not been narrowly targeted the way that everyone who ever does a sanction claims that they are, and that it has been done very little to actually, thwart Assad or anybody else.
Where's the evidence?
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Where's the evidence? Right? Brianna just made a really good point. Let me go back a little bit.
Assad or anybody else.
Where's the evidence that Assad can
thwart Assad to actually, thwart they are, and that it has been done very little to actually about the fact that the sanctions have not been narrowly targeted the way that everyone.
Yes, the narrowness or lack thereof of the sanctions, right? So, are these broad sweeping? And we were talking about Wikipedia yesterday, and these broad blanket bans of Wikipedia just totally take Wikipedia off, as opposed to, and one effort might be to actually find specific things to ban, but another would be to, let's say, if you have editors, or even if you want to create a political campaign to encourage people, users and otherwise, to edit Wikipedia, and we could apply that to Syria, right? What types of aid are being sent there? Are they blanket violent aids? This concept that aid is somehow related to military presence it could be faulty logic. It truly could.
And whoever does the sanction claims that they are, and that it has been done very little to actually, thwart Assad or anybody else.
Where's the evidence that Assad can only hold out X more weeks or months or years? There's no evidence.
Right. Well, so the idea is that sanctions prevent, monetary transfers that could be used to, let's say, buy weapons or do other things that the American government says it has an interest in preventing. But the reality is, it's preventing the import of food. It's preventing the import of certain agricultural products that are necessary to buy food. Syria was agriculturally independent in relatively recent history. This was an achievement that they really celebrated, I think, about 20 years ago. But now there's certain products like fertilizers that can be used also for explosive reasons. We see this in the United States. There's a limit on how much fertilizer you can buy, like Walmart and stuff like that. So they're dual-use products that are necessary for agriculture that they can't import because of the sanctions. Moreover, there is farming equipment and other kind of technical stuff that they can't get into the country that's preventing them from being able to grow their own food, and on and on and on down the line.
And we know there's a blowback effect to this as well. We know, let's say we only care about, the U.S. policy is only interested in its own national security, not the suffering of the Syrian people. But when you cause people to suffer and to die like this, and they know, and we want them to blame the Syrian government, but how many of them actually blame the U.S. or blame the West and become interested in extreme ideas, or have or that die, and then their family members become interested in terrorism or something like that, and then they hate us even more. They want to cause us harm. Like, we know that is a phenomenon that happens.
Yeah.
I'd like to see the evidence for that. The evidence for not only that, but the frequency of that, right? Because that is a popular narrative here in the United States, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is as frequent as it is narrated, relative to other narrations that are true and frequent in some ways.
Seen that happen. We know our interventions, our interferences, our attempts to wrangle that part of the world and the suffering that causes invites challenge to us, invites revenge.
And for me, seeing a person like Robbie Suave contextualize this in his mind and reverberate it, you can see the delay, the cognitive delay, because of the years and years of indoctrination regarding the opposite.
Yeah.
How many times do we have to learn that lesson before we change course on some of these policies?
Apparently, it's not today. Today's not the day we learn a lesson. It's worth also just noting, saying a little bit about the magnitude of this earthquake. I mean, truly unprecedented. I think we mentioned in the read that it's the first in the region of this size for about 100 years. It's comparable in magnitude to the 1906, I believe it was, earthquake that flattened San Francisco, left basically all of the city destroyed. It was 7.8 magnitude. And when you look at the pictures of the devastation, it's really horrible. There was.
Yeah, and again, this is not the place where we're going to gawk at the devastation itself, but we will continue to consider these issues.
Winter, Syria is heading into.
Okay, look, Vanessa, let's just talk about sanctions in Syria. I'm sorry.
And this is Vanessa Bealey. This is her personal page as well. The title of the video here is Lift the Criminal Sanctions on Syria Now. She gives some really, really salient details on the situation. There are parts where she talks about, actually, you know what, this is the important part about this. This one is, this video is actually from a month before. So the focus on devastation is not necessarily a part of this.
We had to bump that into the extra, but in the name of humanity is what the graphic says, lift the sanctions against Syria.
Yeah, I mean, talking of dark winters, Syria is heading into a very, very difficult time at the moment. There is literally no fuel available, particularly at the government fuel stations that are to some degree subsidized. No one can afford to buy fuel.
Note again, pre-earthquake.
On the black market. Of course, it's not only the sanctions, it's the occupation of the oil fields by the US. You know, things now are probably the hardest I've ever seen them. And we're coming into really the cold time now, which tends not to really hit hard until after Christmas, but January, February are going to be bitterly cold. And people literally have no heating. In the majority of Damascus and other regions, people are getting between half an hour and 1 hour of electricity per day. The Iranian tankers are slowly kind of dribbling in, but again, the United States is preventing delivery, or of course allowing Israel to bomb the road tankers or the convoys that are trying to come through Iraq, through Syria, and down through into Lebanon, that is also energy deprived at the moment. To give you an indication, though, with no fuel, hospitals now are on complete slowdown. It's almost impossible for the public hospitals to carry out operations. They don't have any fuel for generators. Restaurants, all of the kind of what I call fast food, but it's staple diet for Syrians. Falafel,
what is this nothing you talk about?
Sandwiches. All of these bars are shutting down. The majority of shops and markets are having to shut at sunset because, again, they don't have generators to run. There are literally no cars on the road at the moment, nothing. There's no public transport. The government, as an emergency measure, has increased the kind of the weekend from Friday and Saturday to Friday, Saturday, Sunday to try and make it so people don't have to travel for work or to go to university or to school, because it's impossible to get even public transport, even the service or the Pullman, which run on different fuel to normal cars here. But if you can imagine, the average salary in Syria is around $27 per month, 150,000 Syrian pounds. 20 liters of car fuel, which they call benzene here, on the black market is 200,000 to 300,000. So that gives you an indication that it's completely out of reach. Food is out of reach. Meat is out of reach. Cheese is out of reach of the majority of families here, below the 90% that are below the poverty line. So what I'm asking is, what shocked me when I put out all this information on Twitter was the amount of people that said to me in response, "Oh, I didn't know this was going on. I didn't know Syria was under sanctions." I was like, it's only 11 years, you know? So people really need to do something about this. You know, we need to accept that we have agency, and that agency, even if it's just writing an email, writing a letter, please do something. There are people literally dying here on the streets because of illegal sanctions that are being imposed by the UK and the US. It doesn't have UN mandate. They're unilateral sanctions. They're affecting humanitarian supplies and hospitals and medical supplies. That's illegal. It's completely illegal. It is
Unilateral sanctions affecting humanitarian aid and involvings are globally illegal. This is a great point as well.
Is punishing the Syrian people because Syria won the war against the West, basically, and the regime didn't fall. The government didn't fall. It's not only still in power, but now, of course, pivoting like everyone is on a line. Sad. He's not only still in power, but he's now a West, basically, and the regime didn't fall. The government didn't topple. Punishing the Syrian people because Syria won the war against the West, basically, and the regime didn't fall. The government didn't topple. President Assad is not only still in power, but he's now, of course, pivoting like everyone is that's non-aligned to the east. He's welcoming the Prime Minister of Belarus. He's having trade talks with Donetsk and Luhansk, obviously with China. UAE is now opening up businesses here in Damascus, South Africa.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Yes, let us. Where is that the narrative? Besides maybe Syria and some other places. We'd like to hear that truth more, if it is a truth, in fact. And the same goes for Vietnam. Yeah.
The embassy has reopened here. So, you know, Syria is pivoting away from the West. The West is becoming irrelevant. For the people of Syria, the suffering continues.
Yes, and there is the other portion of it is this realignment. And the realignment, it absolutely validates the pertinence of this type of media. So, you know, we advocate that everyone like, share, and subscribe, of course, because what that does is it creates a butterfly effect, and the dissemination of information can continue to help us grow.
Their resources are being hijacked and held hostage. Their crops are being burned. Their water is being also occupied and rationed. They have no fuel. They have no electricity. They have no heating fuel at all. No gas. A bottle of gas, which will last 1 week for the average Syrian family, which can be extended up to 15, 20 people in one household, costs over now 200,000 on the market. As I said, the average salary, most people are below that, is 150,000. So they can't afford gas for heating and for cooking. I mean, it's very difficult for people to actually understand what life is like here, but it's the toughest it's ever been. And people, please do something. Raise hell on Twitter, on social media. Write to your governments. Get them, to your MP, to your representatives. This is a humanitarian issue. It's not a political issue. It's not a diplomatic issue. If you want an example of a very, very good statement made by Alina Duhan, who was appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on the effects of sanctions, go to my Substack. I've published it in full. That will give you all the ideas you need to put into an email or a letter. But please do it. Please don't just watch this and then kind of go back to doing what you were doing before. Please do.
Yeah, visit Vanessa Bealey's Substack. Vanessa Bealey. Visit her Substack.
Something, because the Syrian people really do need it. I can't describe the suffering here and the hopelessness and the despair in Syria right now.
Is Russia doing anything to help on a humanitarian basis?
Of course Russia is helping. It's helping to the best of its ability. I mean, it's helping more on a military front, of course. It's been increasing pressure on the United States, really by proxy through guerrilla warfare in the northeast. It's negotiating with Turkey and with the Kurds for the Kurds to withdraw and for the Syrian army to secure the borders with Turkey. It's doing everything it can, but to some degree, Russia has been helping since 2015. And don't forget also the Caesar sanctions that were applied under the Trump administration that penalize any nation that comes to the help of Syria. So to some degree, what Russia is doing can't be spoken about publicly, because Russia will receive further sanctions. China will receive further sanctions. South Africa, Czechoslovakian embassy stayed open throughout the conflict here. But they can't talk openly about what they're doing to try and help Syria because their country will be penalized.
Russia's also under sanctions, which makes it even worse. Iran is a traditional ally of Syria, would normally do more, has trouble doing it. The whole game is to keep the border of Iraq and Syria unstable, so there can't be good, healthy cross-trade across the region, and that isolates Syria. The problem is, and we can say the sanctions are illegal, and of course they are illegal under Geneva Conventions, international law, and other things. But in Europe and Britain and the United States especially, and Canada, they don't see it as illegal. They disregard international law. Of course, that's the real problem. So then you're left with what? You need to be targeted. You got to find out if there are sympathetic MPs in England or in the UK or in Ireland or in Europe, real members of parliament, not European parliament, but people who actually in the real government. And they could actually raise the issue and perhaps rally around it from a humanitarian point of view. That seems to be one of the only hopes you have of breaking the sort of logjam on this issue, which is almost like you get no movement whatsoever on this, but because nobody wants to champion it. It doesn't have a lot of political capital attached to it. There's not much to gain if you are championing this in a Western country, but if you could break the siege, as it were, the political siege, there is a chance that crack would appear and you would get more support coming in.
Yeah, so this drip of applying pressure on those denying humanitarian aid. And I saw the viral crawl of it yesterday. That when I first began to look into this, there were only a few articles here and there, and then I began to see real community activism. Right, that wasn't a bot. I had to see actual people from small outlets, from small journalistic outlets, just pushing this idea of disseminating humanitarian aid.
and maybe some media attention as well. But this is the challenge, and I'm afraid this is really difficult.
Well, it is, but I mean, how many members does UK Column have? If every single member made the effort to write a letter or write an email, you know, the sheer influx of demands to actually look at the humanitarian effects. And as I say, there is an excellent statement now that is in UN archives. They can't ignore it anymore, you know. The UN has ignored this also to a large degree for the last 11 years, but, you know, Alina Duhan has actually really done a fantastic job. I was shocked. And it demonstrates to some extent the sea change as regards Syria, because she openly stated in the first or second paragraph that actually most of the information came through government institutions, Syrian civil society and medical care centers, etc. So this is a kind of a normalization of the government agency in Syria, which has not been accepted before, even by the UN. Taking back agency, you know, we do have agency. I mean, I always remember, and both of you will remember in 2016, when our little campaign actually really did prevent the White Helmets getting the Nobel Peace Prize. So it is possible to do. And I have to say, it's very satisfying.
Great point. Yeah,
you know,
it's kind of a pivot there, so we'll move on. But the White Helmets story, there's another one, you know. But well, maybe I'll add that to the list, of course, right? Yeah, but that was great. Let's look at another one of these related ideas. This is let's see, Edward Horgan. He is a former UN peacekeeper. Press TV brings up some really grounded points here.
The sanctions, in particular, are being imposed primarily by the US and the European Union. Sanctions imposed in circumstances like this kill people. I would call immediately for all sanctions on Syria to be removed, and for all countries to give as much aid as possible to Turkey and a similar amount to Syria. I visited Aleppo with an Irish peace group in 2017. I saw the devastation that had been caused in Aleppo then. Clearly, a large area of northwestern Syria had been very severely damaged, and humanitarian emergency needs to be addressed. So very clearly, the sanctions imposed by the US, European Union and others are now causing very severe damage. Also, the US is at the moment in illegal occupation of part of northeastern Syria. It has at least 900 troops. Likewise, Turkey is also illegally occupying part of northwestern Syria. These countries shouldn't be interfering directly in Syria, and now in the middle of this crisis, it's vital that a huge amount of humanitarian effort is needed, not only in Turkey, but equally in the sanctions.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, we'll move on as well, but this person speaking, Edward speaking, just, I began to think about some other outlets, because, okay, so there's some, there are non-Western outlets that you won't hear a particular narrative about the earthquake being divine justice for the atrocities that these places have committed, right? These countries have committed. I mean, this is just, you know, anthropomorphism, you know, of deities, right? There's Pangea, right? The earth is constantly moving, and to credit it to proclivities and dispositions towards particular countries that's a farce. That makes sense in no way. Maybe I'll pull up an issue on that, or a segment on that. One more Press TV clip. This is Muhammad Ali in Damascus. He's on the ground.
The search and rescue operations continue, and chances are decreasing, unfortunately, for finding those who might be still alive under the rubble. Over there, we have teams coming from various countries to help and assist the Syrian government in the search and rescue operations. Syria's prime minister also is touring various areas in the northern parts of Syria and in Latakia, touring the temporary shelter centers established for those who have become displaced as a result of the collapses. The humanitarian aid continues to arrive into Syria in various parts of Syria. Airplanes are landing in Damascus International Airport, also in the airports of Aleppo and Latakia, coming from various countries, mainly Iran, Russia. Also, humanitarian assistance is coming from Algeria, Libya, the UAE, and Jordan, including
Iran, Russia, Algeria, Libya, the UAE, and Jordan, all in support. All in support. I actually did a little bit of research yesterday, and there was an approximation that 70 to 80 countries have sanctions on the on Syria, and that's juxtaposed with the almost 200 countries, 193 countries that there are in the world, and two others that are what do you call them, observers. Yeah, but yeah, this idea that, you know, majority of the, I'm not exactly sure of the population distribution between those countries, but if you think of it by country, almost three times the amount of countries that are against these sanctions than for. These are the numbers. This is ratioing. This is rationale.
Of course, Iraq. Such humanitarian assistance is very important at such times.
The whole notion of logic.
And despite the fact that they might be not enough compared to the scale of destruction and efforts needed, and the large number of people who have become displaced, but definitely such assistance is very important. Also, very important comments that recently came out from Syria's foreign minister, Dr. Faisal al-Maqdad, in the past 24 hours. He said in a televised interview that all humanitarian assistance is being blocked due to the U.S. sanctions on Syria. And Mr. al-Maqdad said that the U.S. Officials are claiming recently that their sanctions on Syria do not cover humanitarian aid or assistance. And replying to that, Dr. al-Maqdad said that the U.S. sanctions is blocking everything that might come to Syria. The search and rescue operation.
Yeah, so there are officials, and I think we may have read a quote from McDodd in a Mayadeen article at the beginning of this segment. There are officials who say that no aid has gotten through. And finally, here's an article by Press TV. It says, and this is ironic in a way, I wanted to end this way because I think it speaks a lot to the humanity of those who deny the aid. Hezbollah sends aid convoys to quake-hit Syria, decries U.S.-led sanctions. Yeah, Hezbollah is the party of Allah, right? The Lebanese Hezbollah resistance movement said it has sent convoys of humanitarian aid to earthquake-affected areas in Syria in the wake of a devastating earthquake that struck the Arab country amid crippling Western sanctions. Hezbollah Deputy Secretary General Sheikh Naim Qassem told Lebanon's Arabic-language Al-Manar television network on Tuesday that countries around the world must rush to send rescue workers, equipment, and aid to help victims of the earthquake. He offered his condolences to the Syrian nation and government, saying Hezbollah has dispatched convoys of humanitarian aid to quake-hit areas. A devastating 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck southeastern Turkey and northwestern Syria early Monday, and the rescue workers are still working and freezing temperatures. Sheikh Qasim argued that the sanctions, backed by most Arab countries, are hampering relief and rescue operations, adding that the coercive measures run contrary to the fundamental humanitarian principles. Contrary to the fundamental humanitarian principles. The top Hezbollah official stressed that the West must realize that the Syrians are all united in the fight against Takfiri militant groups, and that the nation will not accept any foreign diktats. He also underscored that Hezbollah stands by the side of Syria and Turkey in the aftermath of the tragic incident. Early on Tuesday, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent called on the United States and the European Union to lift the siege and economic sanctions against Syria, which are severely hampering relief work in quake-stricken areas of the country. Foreign Minister Fazel Mekdad, mentioned twice before here, has also highlighted Syria's need for humanitarian assistance from the earthquake, warning that U.S. sanctions have worsened the circumstances as the illegal bans have prevented the delivery of everything to the country. What exacerbated the tragedy and catastrophe was the sanctions imposed by the United States and Western countries on Syria, Mekdad said on Tuesday. While Americans claim that they did not impose sanctions on humanitarian aid, we tell them that your sanctions prevent everything from Syria, including the purchase of medicines, just as Washington and its Western allies give orders to some countries and threaten them with sanctions if they deal with Syria or any Syrian banks, he added. So it must be clarified, and this is like the next step in this journalistic direction. The next point or the next step is that it is said by the Western countries and by the United States that the aid itself is getting through, and that the sanctions themselves do not block the aid, but the sanctions are broader than it seems or it is believed. And I think that's very important as well. So Syria has been in the throes of foreign-backed militancy since March 2011, so on and so forth. So there we are. We think about this. We think about the scope of this situation, and we'll definitely cover more on this future dates. We're going to now go to some all access information. This is our all access segment. So Glenn Greenwald, well, this is just last night actually. There are two videos I have from Glenn Greenwald for this show. Glenn Greenwald last night Glenn Greenwald last night on his system update show he streamed an episode entitled ChatGPT and the Uncertain Future of Artificial Intelligence, plus taking on big tech with Representative Ken Buck. I didn't get to the Ken Buck portion, but the portion about ChatGPT, which we will unpack in our log hour, which is our post show, is important as well, is something that relates to today's censorship issues, and he connected those censorship issues to Wikipedia. Here's his segment on that.
And in this regard, it really replicates the problem that Wikipedia has run into, when the idea of Wikipedia was it would automatically be a content-neutral, ideology-neutral site because it would be run by a community. But over time, Wikipedia, as everybody who knows, especially if you have an entry in it, has become increasingly liberal in its outlook. The person who has said that most loudly is not myself, but the co-founder of Wikipedia, who has said, quote, as the Independent notes here in this 2021 article, quote, nobody should trust Wikipedia, says the man who invented Wikipedia. Quote, there's a complex game being played to make an article say what somebody wants it to say. And one of the reasons why this has happened is because in order for Wikipedia to decide what information it will and won't use, it needs to tell itself what are and are not reliable sources. It defines what a reliable source is and isn't, and then it decides which examples of media outlets can be used and which ones can't.
Yeah, so, yeah, that article that was just mentioned, nobody should trust Wikipedia, says man who invented Wikipedia. He says there's a complex game being played to make an article say what somebody wants it to say. This is, and yesterday our segment was related to this, was about Wikipedia in Pakistan, who was saying the same thing, but it was in relation to a subject matter that may not have support in certain areas and then may have broader support in other areas. But Glenn, he frames this as a U.S. pseudo right-wing free speech situation. Also, as a journalist, free speech and dissemination of information is top priority, right? And we know this from journalism school, right? We learned this at university. So Larry Sanger, the man who co-founded Wikipedia, has cautioned that the website can't always be trusted to give people the truth. He said it can give a reliably established point of view on pretty much everything. Can you trust it to always give you the truth? And see, this is the thing. An establishment point of view, it's not going to give you the truth. Well, it depends on what you think the truth is, said Mr. Sanger, who co-founded Wikipedia in 2001. He told Lockdown TV that if only one version of the facts is allowed, then that gives a huge incentive to wealthy and powerful people to seize control of things like Wikipedia in order to share up their power. And they do that. He said Wikipedia seems to assume that there's only one legitimate, defensible version of the truth on any controversial question. That's not how Wikipedia used to be. Wikipedia is visited by millions every day and is the first online repository for information for many. Mr. Sanger cited the example of an article about the U.S. President Joe Biden. Very little of that can be found. He argued that there should be at least a paragraph about the Ukraine scandal, but there isn't. And the Wikipedia founder also said that there are companies that hire paid writers and editors to go in and change articles. So maybe there's some way to make such a system work, but not if the players who are involved and who are being paid are not identified by name. They actually are supposed to be identified by name and say, we represent this firm, if they're officially registered with some sort of Wikipedia editing firm. There are Wikipedia editing firms, right? Wikipedia editing is not just done by individuals. There are firms. Firms are companies. Companies are corporations. Corporations are also people, according to Citizens United, which is controversial and, in my estimation, not equivocal to humanity. So he cautioned that Wikipedia is known now by everyone to have a lot of influence in the world. So there's a very big, nasty, complex game being played by behind the scenes to make the article say what somebody wants them to say. So there we have it. I mean, that's blanket, and that's from the creator, or is it the creator or the owner of Wikipedia? The man who invented it, the inventor of Wikipedia. Let's go on with Glenn.
And the bias becomes immediately evident. I'm somebody who has had a Wikipedia page, I think for, I don't remember exactly when I had one, I think definitely more than a decade, going back maybe to 2009, 2010. And I can watch, you can look at the history of my Wikipedia page as it went from something overwhelmingly positive when I was still universally supported by the liberal left, and it just morphed into something much more mixed as I began to have breaches with American liberalism, and now almost every paragraph has become infused with negative connotations, including about events from 15 and 20 years ago, simply because I have my standing among American liberals and the establishment wing of our political spectrum have changed, and that is
that's a bit conjecture. That's conjecture in general. I think the only thing that Glenn Greenwald is an amazing journalist. The only thing that I have an issue with Glenn Greenwald is his concept of the left and the right and his propagation thereof, as if these groups are monoliths and they're mutually exclusive to one another.
Something that everyone will tell you. And the reason that matters is because Wikipedia is not just a site that you go to if you want, it is connected to Google. If you enter anyone's name on Google, the first thing that appears automatically is their Wikipedia page. It is a major source of information that people assume to be true, and yet the rules that were created around it, the decision-making about what it can and cannot consider to be reliable is what has slanted it on purpose, even though you can't point to any rule that explicitly does that. And let me just show you how that works. So Wikipedia has what it calls a reliable sources page. Here you can see that page. This is the list of the sources an editor or a user is allowed to use and is not allowed to use. And so one of the things they do is they define what a reliable source is. And so here they have a section that's called self-published sources, meaning an individual who does not work for a gigantic media corporation, but who instead self-publishes. And that counts, for example, independent journalists who write at Substack, many of whom, including myself, have hired a team, a newsroom of editors and reporters, but nonetheless, they're considered self-publishers. So automatically by Wikipedia standards, they cannot be treated as a reliable source. So anything that Matt Taibbi writes, or Andrew Sullivan writes, or Barry Weiss writes, or that I wrote when I was at Substack, or any of the people who are at Substack or who have blogs who are not part of media corporations, automatically is banned from any consideration by Wikipedia. There you can see the text on the screen, quote, anyone can create a personal web page, sub-publish a book, or claim to be an expert. That is why self-published materials such as books, patents, newsletters, personal websites, open wikis, personal or group blogs, as distinguished from news blogs, content farms, internet forum postings, and social media postings are largely not acceptable as sources. Self-published evidence sources may be considered reliable.
And did you hear the sarcasm in his voice when he read that news blogs were separate from these self-published sources, which included journalists? So that means that independent journalists are less recognized and less valid than dependent journalists, right? And one might argue that a journalist's dependency is what makes him or her valid, at least partially.
When produced by an established subject matter expert whose work in the relevant field has previously been published by reliable independent publications, exercise caution when using such sources. So essentially, in order to be deemed to have your work be usable on Wikipedia, you need to be somebody who has become deemed acceptable and who has submitted to the constraints of media corporations. You have to work at CNN or NBC or the New York Times and the Washington Post, and therefore Wikipedia has automatically imported all of the ideological biases that we have documented more than enough times in my journalism in written form on this show as well, and that many other people have as well. So if you look at the list, the actual list, that Wikipedia regards as reliable or not, things that can and can't be used, you find exactly what you would expect to find. So, for example, here you have the Anti-Defamation League.
You can pause right there. We have to do a, oh, excuse me, the Athon. We should do an unpacking on ADL as well. The next time that they come up in the media, definitely have a complete story for them. And with that, those ideas, I mean, what can you say about Glenn Greenwald? He's thorough, right? We'll continue to discuss some of his leanings as of late, especially the anti-war ones in our next segment. Wikipedia, this is still in relation to Glenn's take on Wikipedia and Pakistan's take on Wikipedia. Wikipedia worries its volunteer editors could be liable to lawsuits within Section 230. Attorneys for the Wikimedia Foundation said even linking to another page could be an issue, depending on how the Supreme Court rules on Gonzalez versus Google. Wikipedia has enjoyed the protections of Section 230 for over 22 years, but an upcoming Supreme Court decision could cause major issues with its community-run volunteer administrators. Community-run volunteer administrators. So these, what is the? I mean, do these people have valid requirements in their CVs? So where does Wikipedia, the world's most visited repository of information on the internet, stand without guaranteed digital liability protections? It's a question weighing heavy on the people who make up the Wikimedia Foundation, the nonprofit organization that administers the site, containing 58 million articles in multiple languages and sees more than 16 billion visits total each month. Having that protection there is what has allowed Wikipedia to be written by thousands of volunteers around the world over the last 22 years, said Wikimedia's foundation, the lead counsel, Leanna Mixter. So without the protections of Section 230, that becomes a much more difficult scenario for us. Just a few short weeks on February 21st, the Supreme Court's going to hear arguments about whether Section 230 of the 96 Communications Decency Act, also known as the 26 words that created the internet, according to journalist turned legal scholar Jeff Kosip, should even exist. Section 230 essentially makes it so websites and platforms aren't considered the publishers of the content users post. It shielded companies from being liable for dangerous or libelous content as much as it's been a boon for people holding powerful entities' feet to the fire. And what's the extent of this Section 230? If Section 230 is so powerful, why regulate the content at all? We'll come back to this on February 21st for sure, right? Just to see what the decision is that's been made. So in a Zoom interview with Gizmodo, Mixter and the nonprofit's legal director Jacob Roberts said they've run scenarios for what that site would look like without Section 230, and it wasn't pretty. The problem for Wikipedia especially is that most editing is done by scores of volunteer editors. The mostly self-organized Wikipedia community selects certain users to sand the rough edges of articles, or off articles, edit content, or even block certain users. There's even select groups who determine the article that appears on the Wikipedia's front page. So the question is, the mostly self-organized Wikipedia community selects certain users. How does it select these users? How does it select these users, right? We can definitely come back to that. Let's see if we get some insight into that now. This page summarizes the various processes and structures by which Wikipedia articles and their editing are editorially controlled, and the processes which are built into that model to ensure quality of article content. And again, this is from Wikipedia's perspective, so we've moved away from this Gizmodo article, and this is a Wikipedia article. Rather than one sole form of control, Wikipedia relies upon multiple approaches, and these overlap to provide more robust coverage and resilience. There are tens of thousands of regular editors, everyone from expert scholars to casual readers. With the exception of blocked users, anyone who visits the site can edit it. And this fact has encouraged contribution of a tremendous amount of content. There are mechanisms that help community members watch for bad edits, a few hundred administrators with special powers to enforce good behavior, and a judicial-style arbitration committee that considers the few situations remaining unresolved and decides on withdrawal or restriction of editing privileges or other sanctions when needed. After all, the consensus remedies have been tried. So this is what we have here. This is important because we can look at each part of the editing process. We can look at the administrators with quote unquote special powers to enforce good behavior, right? Even the choice of words. Yeah. And a judicial style. Judicial style. This is very legal. They chose some really, they must have edited. I would like to, maybe we should go to the editing page of this, see how many times this has been edited, right? And it decides on withdrawal or restriction of editing privileges. There's a judicial style arbitration committee that considers the few situations remaining unresolved and decides on withdrawal or restriction of editing privileges or other sanctions when needed. Oh my gosh. This is this judicial style arbitration committee, the JSAC. Yeah, I'd like to see a list of the members of the JSAC, right? So that's all very interesting. You go a little bit beyond what I thought we would there. And let's see. Yeah, we'll come back to all of that. The point is that, you know, we have people from different orientations politically who are pushing back against Wikipedia's editing process and its regulation of content as well. Big issues. These are all big issues, right? And so now, you know, we've been thinking about journalistic integrity. And I think at this point, we should definitely get into our muckraking.
Today's unemployment figures show the economy is moving in the right direction. The drop in unemployment is one more sign that the economy is strengthening.
So, Glenn Greenwald dealt with in an episode maybe 3 days ago, definitely this week, or maybe at the end of last week. It was this week. It was February 6th. It was 2 days ago. Pro-war propagandists, how bloodthirsty media push us toward every new war. And again, I saw similarities between what he was covering and what I was covering, so I wanted to bring his ideas in and have a conversation with him digitally.
Media was anti-Bush and anti-Cheney. And again, I'm going to leave that to history. I think it's quite disputable. If you look at the 2000 election, for example, the media loved to try and turn it into a question of with whom would you rather have a beer, George W. Bush or Al Gore. They kind of liked Bush, just they found him a more likable person. Gore was notoriously kind of hectoring and alienating. He had a very cold personality the media disliked. And they often openly acknowledged that they found Bush more appealing, that they had a warmer sensation to George Bush. But when it came to the war on terror and the Iraq war, I think people have forgotten how quickly the U.S. media united behind that entire Bush-Cheney agenda. A very big reason why the war in Iraq and the war on terror generally was able to be sold not only to conservatives who naturally supported it because it was being sponsored by the Republican Party under Bush and Cheney, but large numbers of the sector of American liberalism, to the point that 80% of Americans approved of George W. Bush throughout the end of 2001 and into 2002, and 70% or more of Americans supported the Iraq War at the time that it was launched, was because there had been so much penetration of support for the Bush-Cheney neocon war on terror and Iraq war into sectors of American liberalism, and that was led by the American liberal media. It would have been impossible to convert 70% of Americans into supporters of the war on terror and the Iraq war without having not Fox News, behind that agenda, although they certainly were, but without having the most trusted liberal voices, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, John Kerry, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Yorker. The journals that liberals trusted the most were completely unified behind every proposed new war. They loved it. And to this day...
And there was also a conflation of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden, and Al-Qaeda. There was an inflation of all of these things. Excuse me, not an inflation, a conflation of all of these things. And the same type of conflation occurred with the beginning of the Gulf War in the 90s with Saddam Hussein, if memory serves me correctly.
That, more than anything, is their most predictable attribute. Outside of the culture war, where they're reliably left liberal, for the reasons I described, the demographic reasons, when it comes to the more substantive questions of economic policy and foreign policy, they're not leftists as much as they are devotees to status quo power and institutional authority. And it's almost impossible to overstate how pro-war the employees of large media corporations have always been. And that's the reason why the only place one can now find dissent and opposition to things like the war in Ukraine and even the attempt to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and before that, the regime change operation undertaken by NATO to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, came from Fox News. There's a sector of the American right, the populist right in media.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Outside of the culture war, where they're reliably left liberal, for the reasons I described, the demographic reasons, when it comes to the more substantive questions of economic policy and foreign policy, they're not leftists as much as they are devotees to status quo power and institutional authority. And it's almost impossible to overstate how pro-war the employees of large media corporations have always been. And that's the reason.
If you see a commercial for Northrop Grumman or some other military product producing company, you should be insulted. You should feel insulted. And I feel like the sentiment is going that way with not only particular countries, but humanity. There is no tolerance for wars for the most part, especially amongst millennials, not unlike myself. And so there has been a change in government wherein there was a declaration of war in years past when wars occurred. But at this point, there is no declaration. That declaration must happen by way of the executive branch. So it disempowers the executive branch to not require that declaration.
The reason why the only place one can now find dissent and opposition to things like the war in Ukraine and even the attempt to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and before that, the regime change operation undertaken by NATO to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in Libya.
Ukraine, Syria, and Gaddafi and Libya. Ukraine, Syria, and Libya connected by Greenwald. This is, beyond poetry. It's logic.
The whole notion of logic
came from Fox News. There's a sector of the American right, the populist right in media, that is more anti-war than any other sector of the media, which continues to be as fervently and passionately in favor of any new war that's on the table. And to demonstrate just how impossible it is to overstate that, I want to show you an interview that Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky did with CNN host Kate Baldwin in 2017 when the media was indignant over Donald Trump's refusal to do much more than he was doing to engage in regime change in Syria. They had watched what happened in Iraq, where we overthrew the regime of Saddam Hussein, and in its wake brought nothing other than extreme chaos and instability in the region that even Tony Blair acknowledges is what gave rise to ISIS. It brought almost no benefit to the United States. So the Iraqi governments that were elected were far more favorable to Iran than they were to the United States. They were far more favorable to Iran than Saddam Hussein was. They strengthened Iran, they strengthened ISIS. Even after watching...
Yeah, and in one breath I thought, oh, this is too historical, right? This is too like far back in the past, and it doesn't apply as much, even though there are issues in Syria and in Iraq and Iran still. This is just from 20 years ago, so it really is not important. But what spawned me covering this was not this particularly. I heard it and I was, it caught my ear. But what really helped me or encouraged me to do this story was that there's a February 5th article from Al Mayadeen echoing these sentiments. And this is just from 2 days ago, right? So there are, on multiple fronts, we're seeing a rehashing of the West's exploitations in this area. So let's read through this. Same Iraq war lie used in Syria, says Mekdad. And this is the same foreign minister. This is the same foreign minister of Syria that was mentioned in prior articles that we've read today. 20 years after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad recalls how U.S. President George Bush lied about Iraq's alleged WMDs to launch the invasion. This is almost verbatim of what Greenwald was saying. Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad recalled that the Bush administration was determined to attack Iraq for a number of reasons beyond Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction, right? On a day like, if it was just for that, right? Of course, Bush administration was determined to attack Iraq for a number of reasons beyond Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. But even if it was just for that reason, that wouldn't be enough because, of course, they were not real. On a day like today, 20 years ago, and near the Syrian seat where I was sitting in the Security Council, the then U.S. Secretary of State, Colin Powell, staged a scene of manipulation and lies to justify the U.S. invasion of Iraq on the pretext that it possesses weapons of mass destruction, Mekdad tweeted.
The whole notion of logic.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Mekdad added that Powell presented audio recordings, satellite images, testimonials, and documents at the time, claiming that they are evidence rather than speculation, facts, and well-documented information, and showing a small tube containing Iraqi-produced biological substances capable of killing tens of thousands of people.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious. Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Of course, it became clear that everything he put forward was mere unsubstantiated lies. And Powell himself described what he said before the Security Council as a disgrace. But sadly, Iraq was invaded on the basis of these lies, and everyone knows the disastrous results left by the invasion of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by U.S. forces on their allies in Iraq, the foreign minister stressed. Mekdad emphasized that the U.S. and its agents in France, Britain, and Germany are engaging in the same games and lies to launch the war against Syria, just like they did in Iraq 20 years ago, under the guise of its possession of weapons of mass destruction. He advised the world to learn from history and not allow the U.S. and its allies, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany, to repeat similar deception or use false claims to justify interfering in the affairs of other countries and undermining their security, stability, and prosperity. Bush lied, people died. U.S. President Joe Biden was one of the 77 senators who gave President George Bush the authority to use force in Iraq back in October 2002. This is a salient point, right? This is a very salient point. Biden was with it as well. Biden was with it as well. U.S. military officials admitted that some troops committed abuses, claiming always independently of senior commanders, and claimed that more than 300 criminal investigations were opened in response to accusations of a prisoner mistreatment, and that 100 soldiers were subjected to court-martial proceedings and administrative punishments. Washington, along with coalition forces, invaded Iraq in March 2003 after toppling Saddam Hussein under the pretext of disarming Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. So there was a conflation of weapons of mass destruction in Saddam Hussein, and then later on there was a conflation of Saudi Arabia, 9/11, Osama bin Laden, and Iraq. The U.S. invasion of Iraq left at least 5 million Iraqi orphans, murdered over 100,000 Iraqis, forced 4 to 5 million Iraqis to flee their homes, displaced ancient Iraqi minority groups, and destroyed much of Iraq's infrastructure and economy. And so there we have it. Let's go back to a bit more of this Greenwald.
Everything that happened in that Iraq war, they were desperate to due to Syria, what they did to Iraq, which was overthrow Bashar al-Assad, even though obviously Assad was not in any way
the whole notion of logic.
I mean, how paralleled can these two pieces be, right?
And anybody who even expressed any kind of hesitation was despised openly by the media. So let me show you this interview. It was actually Congressman Massey himself who reminded me this weekend of this interview. I don't remember having seen it the first time, but it's very common and illustrative of just how explicit they are. Let's take a look.
Hey, Congressman, as you are against intervention. You say that is what you hear from your constituents, and you say that's what you heard from your constituents previously. But as you sit here today and you see these images coming out of the slaughter of innocent children, does that change your view?
Well, with all due respect to the senator from Arizona, he's wrong. And he's not.
The context was that John McCain, as always, and this was the reason he was the most beloved figure by the media, had come out along with Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and his standard crowd, along with neocons like Joe Lieberman, and they were demanding that the U.S. should engage in regime change. There you see on the screen, McCain has said that the U.S. should dedicate itself to removing Assad. This is in April 2017, so less than 3 months after Donald Trump was inaugurated as president. John McCain was already undercutting him, saying that we should immediately go, despite all the problems that the United States had, despite McCain having watched the havoc that he and his friends wreaked in Iraq and then in Libya, and go and do the same thing to Syria. The U.S. should dedicate itself not to help the American people, but to removing Assad. So that was the context, and they were throwing that in Thomas Massey's face, like John McCain, the good Republican, says that this is what we should do.
Expressing the will of the American people. But I hope that the senator and I can agree that President Trump cannot unilaterally attack a country. He cannot commit an act of war against a sovereign nation without a vote in Congress. So this really isn't up to Rex Tillerson or the president at this point.
If the president of Syria is committing.
Do you see how she just ignored that? She's not the slightest bit interested in what he said. It's kind of an important point. There's this thing we have in the United States called the Constitution. It governs how our government is supposed to function. And the decision about whether to go into a new war, which obviously is what this would be, it would be a regime change war in Syria, is not left unilaterally to Donald Trump. It's a vote that is supposed to be undertaken by the Congress. You can't just demand that Trump go and start a new war in Syria, even though that is how our government works.
And another point that just came to mind, because I covered the Pakistani story yesterday, and I've been thinking about Imran Khan's situation Imran Khan was supported by, was propagandized in ways by Western media as being, something in between the quote unquote misdirected barbaricness of non-Westernness and the civility of Westernness. And he wore a suit, tied, same thing with Assad, right? But once these people were in power, once these leaders garnered power, they were just part of the system again, a part of that system that was barbaric and corrupt and not Western. So maybe we should read Edward Said's Orientalism. I don't know.
In 2010, 2011, when Obama finally got persuaded by Hillary Clinton and Samantha Power and Susan Rice to join the French-German, or rather the French-British war in Libya, the regime change operation in Libya, to overthrow Gaddafi, there was no vote in the Congress to authorize that war. In fact, there was a vote about whether that war should be authorized, and the Republicans, who had the majority in the House, voted against its authorization. Obama went ahead and did it anyway. So it's not even just that he lacked the congressional authority to fight that war in Libya, it's that the House actually voted against it. Now, if the House really meant it, they could have and would have done a lot more. They could have defunded that war. They didn't do any of that. But nobody cares. Nobody cares. You see what he just said. You're demanding Trump start a war, but he doesn't actually have that power. And all she wants to say is, but what about these images of these children? She just wants this war at all cost.
Crimes against humanity, slaughtering his own people. Do you think there is something short of going to war with Syria that you can support?
Is denying humanitarian aid slaughtering people?
The whole notion of logic.
Your fellow Republican, Adam Kinzinger, says, yes, there is something short of that. You can ground Assad's Air Force. You can crater the airstrips that the Air Force is taking off from to commit these atrocities. Can you?
Look at how excited she was there. This was Adam Kinzinger back in 2017 saying, we don't have time to go to war with Syria. We don't have to have a full-scale war yet. Instead, let's just kind of crater their airspace, crater their runways, and create a no-fly zone in Syria, telling Assad where he is and isn't permitted to fly within his own country, which obviously means two things. One, that you have to back up that direction so that if Assad does decide to go fly where the United States government has somehow told him he's not allowed to fly, you have to then go and shoot down his planes, which means you're, of course, involved in a war. When you impose a no-fly zone on another country, automatically you're at war with that country. But also, Assad's key ally, Syria's key ally for decades, has been Russia. And Russia was their ally at this time. So you would not only be risking war with Syria, but also with Russia. And over what? Who governs the question of Syria? But you listen to her, and she doesn't care about any of this. She says, okay, well, if you won't give me my full-scale war yet, let's just go and do some minor things that Adam Kinzinger suggests, like crater their runways and tell Assad that if we see him flying in places we told him he can't, we're going to shoot down his planes.
Can I have over that?
Well, I can't speak about classified information on TV, but I can tell you, according to the Washington Post, we've been spending $1 billion a year in funding the rebels in Syria to no good effect, frankly.
Right, but that's not funding the rebels. What do you think about grounding? What do you think about grounding Assad's Air Force?
Well, you know, we had testimony from a military expert in front of Congress that said that's a virtual act of war in Syria, and that we would be at war with the Russians at that point. I think it's a bad idea.
Earlier today, Congressman.
Just watch as this interview unfolds, too. She doesn't even bother to hide with her facial expressions, with her tone of voice, how disgusted she is by his aunt. Now, she's somebody who, if you went up to her and said, well, you clearly wanted this war, she would say, I don't want war. I don't want or not want war. That's not my job. I'm a reporter. I don't have political opinions. I'm just there to report facts. And all you have to do is look at this one interview to see how much that's a fraud. What a farce that is for CNN's reporters to make that claim. I mean, this is nothing. She's berating him. And it gets worse and worse as we go through the interview that she can barely contain her disgust. And all he's really saying is, I don't think we should start a new war with Russia over Syria. And I don't think it would help the Syrian people if we did. And I think we should focus on our own problems at home. That's not exactly a radical viewpoint, although in this world where she's just so hungry for war, it's the only reason people watch CNN is if there's a war. It excites people to get to talk about war. She's not going to go fight in, of course. No one in her family is going to go fight in it. That's for a different kind of American to go do. But she's in her studio. She wants that war. She wants those ratings. She loves it. And she's furious that he won't give it to her.
Bana, she's a little Syrian girl who's become really the voice of...
Okay, so she's going to now whip out the big gun. She's going to show us a Syrian child and make him tell this child, show us a...
pleading for help. What do you say to her, Congressman?
I think what she's asking for is something that all children should enjoy. And I think that our intervention in Syria has prolonged the civil war, and it is not helping there. President Trump campaigned on a more restrained a more restrained foreign policy. And I hope that's what we see. And, you know, we haven't created a better school environment for the children in Iraq, frankly, by destabilizing that country. And I don't think it serves the children of Syria or anybody in the United States to further destabilize Syria.
So you say you see these, you hear that plea from her, you see the images coming out of Syria, and you think the best policy for the United States right now is to do nothing.
What I'm saying...
Apparently, the United States is supposed to go to war anytime they can find a child in some country to say, we don't like our government is repressing us, and we want you to come in, invade our country and to save us. That's the standard she's creating. You could pick a child in any country. You could put a Yemeni child on the screen and say, we want the United States to stop arming the Saudis. Or you can find another Yemeni child and say, we want the United States to come and prevent Iran from arming our country. You could manipulate the public discourse in any way like this. You could find a child in eastern Ukraine to say, we don't like President Zelensky. We don't feel like we should be subject to the rule of this pro-EU government that was installed by the West. We want to be a part of Moscow. Or you can put a different kid on in Ukraine to say, we want the U.S. to come and help us fight. This is grotesque, this kind of propaganda, but that's how desperate they get.
We might end up making the situation worse if we launch airstrikes, if we against their airplanes, against hard targets on the ground. So we really need to step back and take a good look at this. The first casualty of war is the truth, and it's hard to know exactly what's happening in Syria right now. I'd like to know specifically how that release of chemical gas, if it did occur, and it looks like it did, how that occurred. Because frankly, I don't think Assad would have done that. It does not serve his interests. It would tend to draw us into that civil war even further.
Who do you think is behind it? Who do you think is behind it?
You know, you've got a war going on over there. Supposedly that airstrike was on an ammo dump. And so I don't know if it was released because there was gas stored in the ammo dump or not. That's plausible. I'm not saying that's what I think happened, but
You're more inclined to believe the position of what Bashar al-Assad is saying and what the Russians are saying right now than more inclined to believe what even your colleagues here in the United States believe is.
Because there's only two positions, right? In a polemicized world, there are only two positions. There's not this side, that side, and another side, and another side. There aren't multiple versions or vantage points or perceptions. There are only two. There is a subjective opinion, and then there's an opinion that is not the subjective opinion for people like this. And, you know, you got other people like this, because people like this, they dye their hair, they equivocate between war and humanitarian aid, between military aid and humanitarian aid. It's problematic, and it's it invalidates the other things, any other things that person might say.
It's true that this is Assad, and what human rights observers over there say is Assad?
I don't think it would have served Assad's purposes to do a chemical attack on his people. So it's hard for me to understand why he would do that if he did.
I mean, did these people live through the Iraq War? Do they remember that all the people that were supposed to blindly believe the CIA, the Pentagon, America's newspapers, all of these Western institutions of authority who said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, they all got it wrong, either by wanting to lie on purpose or just by being horrifically mistaken about one of the most important questions, if not the most important question of that generation. And less than 15 years later, she's disgusted by the fact that he won't blindly swallow whatever claims are made by the Pentagon or the CIA, which wants to lead the United States into another war. Just how can you question what your own government is telling you? Even though less than 15 years earlier, we all know that they deliberately deceived us, that they have so many times throughout history. But this is the mind of a journalist that says you don't question what the United States government tells you when it comes time for them to want a new war. You just get into line behind it. Now, Congresswoman Massey did allude to the fact that it wasn't like the United States was doing nothing. Under President Obama, the Obama administration authorized at least $1 billion every year to the CIA to engage in clandestine activity designed to destabilize the Assad government and to try and facilitate his removal. They were arming the Free Syrian Army, which ultimately gave way to the real fighters against Assad, which happened to be ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So the United States happened to find itself on the same side of the war as Al-Qaeda.
Free Syrian Army became Al-Qaeda. The United States and other Western countries armed the Free Syrian Army, destabilized the region. It's happened numerous times with different outfits, different countries.
Less than 13 years earlier, having said that our arch enemy, to which we're completely devoted to its destruction, is Al-Qaeda, now the United States wanted to go and fight on the same side of the war as Al-Qaeda and risk a direct war with Russia over Syria. So just by questioning that, she's earning his disgust. Just to underscore how common this was, I mean, by no means was she alone. A separate reporter from CNN, Clarissa Ward, actually admitted how enraged she was under the Obama administration that they refused to do more to have a full-scale war to take out Bashar al-Assad.
And so these are the, well, they just mentioned Assad.
Here you see the headline from CBS News. Author and war correspondent Clarissa Ward on reporting from conflict zones in her new book, Intelligence Matters. Here she admits the following, quote, I wrote Ben Rhodes, that's Obama's senior national security official, an email to his official White House account, and I said, quote, Dear Ben, I hope you're sleeping soundly as Aleppo burns. At least we have the Russians to sort it out. Best wishes, Clarissa. Does that sound anything remotely like an objective journalist to you? Goading him and expressing hatred for him because the Obama administration didn't start a full-scale new war in Syria, just funded the CIA at $1 billion a year to do it. She then said in this interview about her book, quote, as I sent it, there was a voice saying, you know, this is really not a very professional thing to do, Clarissa. You think? But I think you're allowed in the course of your career one story, or where you can just be a human being as well. And I just got sick of hearing the Obama administration trying to pretend that this policy was some kind of a stroke of genius and that it was sort of very well thought out. And
just one story. one story. I just need one story, and then I'll just go back to having integrity, right? That's what she's saying. She's saying she needs one story where she doesn't have integrity, and then she goes back to having integrity. I need one country. I need one invasion. You know what? Can we just have one nuclear bomb? Just one. All right, you asked for it.
Intentional policy, when I knew from having interviewed Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, from having had previous conversations with Ben Rhodes, I knew this wasn't a well thought out policy, but rather a kind of series of improvised decisions to try to avert, getting sucked into a quagmire. Isn't that, by the way, Intelligence Matters is the name of the podcast, not the book. Isn't that something that you actually should want the U.S. government to do, avoid getting sucked into a quagmire? Because if you get sucked into a quagmire, it means that hundreds of billions of dollars get lost, thousands of American lives get lost, you end up killing the children of those countries. And she's, like her CNN colleague, the one we just watched, so disgusted at the idea that the Obama administration was trying to avoid getting sucked into a quagmire in Syria the way we did in Iraq. Remember, Obama was elected based on a promise not to repeat the mistakes of Iraq. Just like, as Congressman Massey said, Trump was elected on a platform to avoid these kinds of regime change wars. She doesn't care at all what the American people want. None of these people in the media do. They want their wars. And I forgot how explicit they were about admitting how hungry and desperate they are for it. Now, again, let's go back to the Iraq War for a second and look.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, journalism, journalistic integrity, honesty, and humanitarian empathy, human empathy. That can be the summation of this segment. And let's continue with these concepts of journalism. This is our muckraking section. Marky Mark Muckrake is this section. Let's go.
Today's unemployment figures show the economy is moving in the right direction. The drop in unemployment is one more sign that the economy is strengthening.
And you know what? In actuality, let me go back to our main screen. Yeah, in actuality, what we're going to do now is going to our post show. This is our first iteration of this. We're going to call it Log. So, Captain's Log, star date, February 8th, 2023.
It is obvious to the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your argument strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should
The
have
whole
respected
notion
us?
of logic.
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again. Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed. Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock,
You have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Glenn Greenwald is the theme today. He posted a segment on ChatGPT. Earlier we talked about Wikipedia and his portion of this episode related to Wikipedia, and this is a portion of it related to ChatGPT.
Warned Stephen Hawking in 2014. Warnings don't get much more strident than that. It could become, warned Elon Musk in 2018, quote, an immortal dictator from which we would never escape. So this new chatbot named ChatGPT is the first time that a large segment of the public has been able to use AI in the wild. And that in turn is allowing people to form their own impressions of it through their personal use, which produces far more engaged and visceral reactions than merely thinking about these topics as abstractions. Just 2 weeks ago, before the launch of ChatGPT, Facebook tried to launch its own AI-driven chatbot that it called Galactica. Yet factual errors and other questionable assertions embedded in the software were quickly discovered.
And ChatGPT did not rectify those. ChatGPT is only going under the radar because it's less important.
Because Facebook is so large and has already been troubled by allegations of spreading disinformation, it cannot afford to have its own chatbot fuel those attacks on the company, whereas OpenAI, as an infinitely smaller company few had heard of, has much more space and license to introduce an imperfect product. So almost overnight, it has become a global sensation. I was unsurprised to see that one of Brazil's largest newspapers, O Globo, this week conducted what it characterized as a, quote, interview with ChatGPT about itself. The paper used the same format it employs for interviews with political figures and cultural celebrities, publishing a lightly edited version of the conversation with questions from the journalist and the interviewee's answers. It really read like almost any other interview you would ever read, except the speech was far more fluent. There are no stutters or likes or you knows. That would be easily capable of those if you asked it to do that. And it was remarkably easy and thus a bit creepy to forget, as one read it, that there was no human being providing those answers. And what is particularly notable about ChatGPT is that while many people have been stunned by what appears to be its sophistication and ability to engage in complex dialogue, employees of OpenAI were concerned when they were told in November that the company would quickly launch this model, because the technology that it is using, the one that we're seeing, is actually relatively antiquated. Some of the engineers of OpenAI thought the public would view the product as primitive and crude, and that they would be embarrassed by it. That's because the version that we have, the one that we're using now, is based on AI technology that existed as of 2020.
You know, I won't say that I'm embarrassed by using ChatGPT, but I will say that ChatGPT apologizes to me constantly when it contradicts itself factually, and I recognize that. It doesn't apologize when I don't recognize that. So there could be instances where it tells me things that I don't recognize as untruths, and they just go by the wayside.
So in terms of the progression of AI research, 3 years is a really long time. The capabilities of artificial intelligence already vastly exceed what we're seeing with this chatbot, that it's captivated so much of the world. And needless to say, those capabilities are only going to grow very rapidly, perhaps exponentially, over the next several years and certainly over the next several decades. One reason why this product has made such a strong impact is that up until now, AI research has been carried out by a tiny handful of companies with virtually no transparency. Over the last decade, just a few Silicon Valley giants, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, have been buying up all the AI brainpower and putting it to work in secret on their AI products. If any breakthrough happens at a university, it is only a matter of time before one of those companies there descends like vultures to make those researchers offers they can't refuse. As a result, a very large percentage of the world's AI brainpower is now concentrated in a small number of companies. The companies very familiar to us that many people I believe most people are now recognizing are far too powerful to coexist with a healthy democracy. But until now, few even knew what this technology was, let alone how it could operate, which made things like regulatory reform or congressional constraints or even just basic journalistic and political transparency all but impossible. And even with the explosion of public interest in AI ushered in by ChatGPT, it is far from certain that any of that will change, as we have seen repeatedly from efforts around the world to rein in some of the most abusive and unlimited powers of big tech. Their massive war chest makes it very easy for them to buy off politicians and whole countries, and very difficult to impose meaningful reforms. Now, in just a few minutes, we're going to show you the interview we conducted an hour or so ago with Republican Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado, who has become one of the foremost experts in big tech, as well as censorship and the use of antitrust laws to rein it in, all as a result of him serving as the ranking member of the House Antitrust Committee. There are real antitrust concerns, obviously, with big tech's ability to control the flow of information, set the limits of political debates, and use its monopoly to prevent marketplace competition. But there are also serious antitrust concerns with AI as well. A chatbot like ChatGPT requires enormous computational capabilities. If you ask it a complicated question, it immediately processes the question and provides often lengthy answers with almost no delay.
Not all of them. There are questions that you can ask it that are computational that it disregards or says that it cannot answer. You know, like some things it can't quantify, right? Just like anything, you know.
As the New York Times noted, quote, ChatGPT is also for now a money pit. There are no ads, and the average conversation costs the company, quote, single-digit cents in processing power, according to a post on Twitter by Sam Altman, OpenAI's chief executive, likely amounting to to millions of dollars a week. Microsoft just invested $10 billion in OpenAI, and that deal made a lot of sense because only a few companies, big tech companies, have enough computing power to make AI work. And so anyone in this space has to rent from Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. What this means is that those firms have total control over the market, which has very big implications for free speech, unless antitrust laws are amended to include prohibitions on self-preferencing, meaning such as when Google deliberately buries Rumble videos, like this one, in its search engines to ensure ongoing primacy of its YouTube video platform. But as we're about to show you, and as anyone who has used ChatGPT already knows, the ability to control one of these chatbots, to decide what it will or won't do, what it regards as credible or unreliable sources of information, what kinds of questions it will or won't answer, is a very potent power. That's how it operates, with those instructions. And that power to give it those instructions will only grow as AI plays increasing roles in our lives. The real-world impact of these AI-driven chatbots are already being seen and felt beyond the fact that we can now play with them. A couple of weeks ago, BuzzFeed announced that it was laying off dozens of its own employees, including writers, and would resort instead to using a paid version of ChatGPT to churn out its most basic and its most popular content, such as quizzes and other short blog posts. They no longer need human beings to do it. The ChatGPT works at least as well, if not better. Now, the schadenfreude from hearing this, that these journalists are so worthless.
Yeah, this I'm not against, you know, like we can use our minds in other ways and we can evolve as humans and focus on things that are more important to us.
That you can easily replace them with a primitive bot and not notice the difference, or would even actually improve the product. The schadenfreude was so intense because not only did the company admit that their writers are so banal and simple-minded that they could easily be replaced by a chatbot, but the market swooned over this idea by doubling the stock price of BuzzFeed overnight, a price that even in its doubled form was still pretty pathetic. As one Twitter user amusingly put it, mocking the multi-pronged failures of our media, quote, I may eventually stop laughing over the combined facts that 1, BuzzFeed is giving up human input, 2, nearly doubles its value on the news, and 3, bringing its pre-share price to under $2. But that day is not today. He was referring to the fact that investors seemed to be very happy that BuzzFeed was firing its pointless and easily replaceable writers with simplistic bots. There you see the stock price showing how overnight the stock price of BuzzFeed virtually doubled, but it was such a battered stock that it only went up to $1.83. Now, putting the laughter about that aside, and trust me, I know it's hard to put that aside, there is no question that these bots are going to expand and start replacing highly educated journalists and others in the professional managerial class. And due to them, what robotic technology has already done to the working class, replace huge numbers of human beings with bots that can perform their jobs much better, more quickly, and with far fewer problems. As Forbes put it when describing the reaction to BuzzFeed's announcement on the market, quote, digital media company BuzzFeed is going big on AI-generated content. According to Forbes, the company plans to use ChatGPT's OpenAI to generate specific content for the site, including quizzes, the first step in greater content creation using the innovative learning engine inside ChatGPT. In a related story, just last month, the company announced it would cut its workforce by about 12%.
And again, I don't see this as a negative thing, right? I don't see the ability to not do menial, repetitive, mindless work and to focus on more so macro managerial things. I don't see that as a negative thing for the evolution of humanity.
It's related because they're replacing those humans with this primitive chatbot. Quote, in 2023, you'll see AI-inspired content move from an R&D stage to part of our core business, enhancing the quiz experience, informing and brainstorming, and personalizing our content for our audience, BuzzFeed Chief Executive Jonah Peretti said in a memo to employees. Now imagine being an employee of BuzzFeed and hearing that increasingly they're going to start laying people off who say nothing interesting, nothing specific, nothing of real value, and therefore can easily be replaced by this bot. Because if you are a writer who never strays from the neoliberal consensus, who never challenges the prevailing orthodoxies and conventional wisdom, who has nothing unique in your voice or your mode of expression, you can and are very vulnerable to being replaced by a bot. An AI bot. That's how worthless the writing and work of these journalists are, how easily they can be replaced.
Now there we go. You see, the diversity of opinion will vanish. Right? And those are a lot of ifs. If this happens, if that happens, if that happens, then this happens. Those are a lot of ifs, right?
And hearing that increasingly they're going to start laying people off who say nothing interesting, nothing specific, nothing of real value, and therefore can easily be replaced by this bot. Because if you are a writer who never strays from the neoliberal consensus, who never challenges the prevailing orthodoxies and conventional wisdom, who has nothing unique in your voice or your mode of expression, you can and are very vulnerable to being replaced by a bot, an AI bot. That's how worthless the writing and work of these journalists are, how easily they can be replaced. Actual journalists who need to go places and confront dangerous power centers and make decisions that require courage, or who have a unique voice or a willingness to think critically, can't at least yet be replaced by these bots, and it will, I imagine, be a long time before they can. You need journalists to go to war zones. You can't send a chatbot to do it. You need journalists who are willing to risk arrest because corporate executives running the chatbot won't do it.
You need journalists to contain a certain body of knowledge that is not as popular as the body of knowledge that is accepted by ChatGPT, or is just different, period, from the body of knowledge that is accepted by ChatGPT, to fact check ChatGPT and the rest of society as a whole. You need that. You need that as a journalist.
So for journalists like that, there's still an important place for.
And in a sense, I guess that is a social sacrifice, right? To not buy into things that are propagandized and what is the term that ChatGPT uses all the time? It's like, well, widely accepted or widely, widely is the term that's used to validate opinion by chatbot. So I'll show you some examples of that in just a moment.
Humans. But the fact that so much of our media can be gutted overnight by a chatbot shows you that our media is really nothing more than people who just read from the most simple-minded scripts.
And this is what I'm saying, right? So I'll show you a few examples because chatbot and I have been having conversations. And I want to point out a few of them to you. Hopefully this will load. It wasn't loading before. Yeah, they're experiencing exceptionally high. It's super popular right now, right? So I'm glad we're doing this. Maybe we'll get some algorithm help here. The first one was related to Khan Kendi. And I'm asking these questions. Look at the let me zoom in here. The lack of subjectivity in this question, right? Try this again. Yes, so I asked it, what is the historical etymology of the term Khan Kendi? Okay. It begins. Khan Kendi is the Azerbaijani name for the city of Stepanakert. So Stepanakert must be the Armenian name, right? You gotta unpack this because it gets really, really iffy really quick. Lots of iffies. Khan Kendi is the Azerbaijani name for the city of Stepanakert, the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh region. And we can unpack Nagorno-Karabakh. In fact, we have the past couple of days. The name Khan Kendi is derived from the Armenian word kank, meaning monastery, and the suffix. Look, some people who know Islamic studies, when you see the word Khan Kendi, do you think kank or do you think Khan? Yeah, so when this was a very quick response on my part, finding that wasn't the truth. The name Khan Kendi is derived from the Armenian word kank, he says, meaning monastery, and the suffix indi, meaning location of or place of. This name reflects the historical presence of a monastery in the area. This is Christianized propaganda. Khan Kendi is located on the Gargar. Hold on. This is Christianized propaganda.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We have the evidence. We saw the evidence. Well, I immediately sent this back. Khan Kendi is located on the Gargar River in the eastern foot of the Caucasus Range. Khan Kendi borders Kalbajar, Tartar. So I just, gave him like super, deep and expounded upon the fact. And then here in the middle, the capital city of, well, let's go even further back. Being relatively young, Khan Kendi differs from other Azerbaijan cities. According to the archive records, the city was founded at the end of the 18th century as a resting place of the Karabakh Khans. You sure it doesn't say Konks? Come on, man. Aga Khan? Imran Khan? To create a maximum condition for Khan's activities, the city was settled at the foot of the mountain in 10 kilometers distance from Panalabad, now Shusha, the capital city of the Khanate. In the first years, only Khan's family and relatives lived in the settlement. That's why it was known as Khan-in-Kendi, Khan's village. After a short time, it was called Khan-Kendi. One reason why, so on and so forth. Khan-Kendi, right? This is, I didn't ask a question. Actually, I did. Considering this information, I just restated the question directly. What is the etymology of Khan-Kendi? The etymology of the term Khan-Kendi. This is Chatbot's new response, original response. The Khan-Kendi is the Azerbaijani name. It's a contradiction if it's an Azerbaijani name and it has to deal with monasteries. Azerbaijan and Azeris are not Christian. Armenians are. This is Armenian propaganda, right? And so here's the real answer. The etymology of the term Khan-Kendi comes from the Azerbaijani language and is derived from Khan-in-Kendi, meaning Khan's village. The city was founded at the end of the 18th century as a resting place for the Karabakh Khans and was initially only inhabited by the Khan's family and relatives. Over time, it became known as Khan-Kendi. I'm not sure. Look, would you say that the sources that gave ChatGPT the Armenian derivation of Khan-Kendi were incorrect? How do you reconcile the conflicting information in your last two replies? I sound like the chatbot now. The information provided in my previous responses may be conflicting. The name Khan-Kendi has a complicated etymology with different sources providing different explanation. It's possible that this name has its origin in both Azerbaijani and Armenian. However, the exact etymology of that name is not clear, and further research and investigation is needed to determine the most accurate origin of the name. Well, why didn't you mention that at first? That's valid. If ChatGPT would have sent that to me originally, or even would have sent me both versions, or sent me one version and then underneath it said, well, this is disputed, that might be something else. But it mixed the Azerbaijani truths with the Armenian truths and leaned more towards the Armenian ones, as if a judge. Yep, I moved on quickly because it had happened before. Let's just check this other one out. This other one is really interesting too. And this one, I knew the answer, and I mean you can tell by the way that I posed the question there. I wrote here, are people from Slavic nations technically slaves? And it immediately responded, no, people from Slavic nations are not technically slaves. The term slave refers to a person who is owned by another person and is forced to work for that person without pay. Historically, slavery has been a widespread practice in many societies, including those in the Slavic region. However, today, slavery is illegal in most countries, so on and so forth. The use of the term slave in reference to people from Slavic nations is incorrect and may be offensive to some. Now, are they Slavs? Just take away the E, right? But this, I continue with that line of thinking. And I said, yes, but technically Slavic nations are owned by other people, thus their names. Also, the two terms Slavic and slave have the same etymological root, so they actually are related. This is where it gets hairy, right? I apologize for any confusion in my previous response. There, chatbot apologizing again. The etymology of the words Slavic and slave is a common misconception.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
The etymology of the word Slavic and slave is a common misconception. It doesn't say the etymology of the word Slavic and slave being related are a common misconception. They are not related, it said at first, remember? And now it says they do not have a direct relationship. So maybe they have an indirect relationship? Is that what? Oh my gosh, what the heck? Yep. So they're not directly related. And so just to blanketly just, to say that they're not related at all and just, they don't have a direct relationship. They do have a direct relationship, actually. And it depends on what you define as direct, but it's a direct relationship. The word Slavic is derived from the old, this is where, this is a lie. This is a full-on lie. The word Slavic is derived from the Old Church Slavonic word Slovo, Old Church Slavonic, which means word or speech. Untrue. And on the other hand, the word slave is derived from the Old French word, because French is a base language. Like French didn't come from Latin. Come on, guy. The Old French word esclave, which comes from Latin, there we go, sclavus, meaning slave or captive, right? So it's also important to note that people of Slavic nations are not currently considered to be slaves. See, and then whenever they do this, it's important to note what you can do, and I've learned just recently, is just say the opposite. And then it will say, you know what? You're right. Like it says, it's important to note that people of Slavic nations are not currently considered to be slaves in the legal or historical sense of the term. Today, slavery is illegal in most countries, including those with Slavic populations, and is widely considered to be a gross violation of human rights. And then when it says these things, just to check it and to keep it in alignment with the way you're thinking, if you're attempting to get honest information from it, you want to give alternate perspectives of these it's important prompts. It says it's important to use language that's historically and culturally accurate. It's also important to use language that is not historically and culturally accurate. You can just say that. And to avoid making false or misleading statements. The experiences and identities of individuals and communities should be respected, and it's important to recognize and address the real and ongoing human rights violations that occur in the world. Absolutely. That's true. But in the same breath, it's not important to recognize those real and ongoing human rights violations that occur. It might be advantageous to not. These are all just concepts that it's just enforcing without any viability besides hearing it so much or having it repeatedly fed into its database over and over again. And so the first thing I do is say, what does this mean? And I find derivation that connects the word Slavic to slave, because that's where it comes from. There's no doubt that is the direct connection. It's a direct connection. What does this mean? From late Latin Sclavus, Slav, from Byzantine, Greek, from Proto-Slavic, Slovenian, because Slavs were often forced into slavery in the Middle Ages. That's it. This statement refers to the and then this is Chatbot's response. It refers to the etymology of the word slave, which has its roots in the late Latin word Sclavus, meaning Slav. The word Sclavus was derived from the Byzantine Greek word sklavos, and is thought to have originated from the Proto-Slavic word Slovenim. The statement claims that the origin of the word slave is related to the fact that Slavic people were often forced into slavery in the Middle Ages. This is a common etymology of the word slave, but it's also important to note that the connection between the word slave and the Slavic people is not direct, and it's based on historical context and linguistic evolution. The use of the word slave has evolved over time. See, this is important to note part. It also has not evolved over time to encompass a broader definition of forced labor or servitude, and today the term is widely used to refer to a person who is owned by another person. The use of the word slave has evolved over time to encompass it, but the use of the word slave also does not encompass a broader definition of forced labor. So my response was, they are etymologically based on historical context and linguistic evolution, which is their words. Like, they didn't want to use the term etymology, but they went and used it anyway. And it's based on historical context and linguistic evolution. That's the definition of etymology. It's language. That's what happens. So they are etymologically based on historical context and linguistic evolution related, just not directly in ChatGPT's data and algorithmically driven opinion. Please do not share the importance of matters. Responses beginning with "it is important to" or any other slightly synonymic variations that communicate the same message are somewhat dogmatic. When two directly or indirectly related things are juxtaposed as if they are not related with the conjunction, on the other hand, their level of relation can be misleading. Are they the same? No. Are they related? Specifically, are they etymologically related? Yes. And I apologize for any misunderstandings in my previous response. Yes, the word Slavic and slave are etymologically related, as the etymology of the word slave is traced back to the Latin word sclavus. So, in my estimation, I feel that I'm overstepping like my etiquette and manners by imposing an idea on the chatbot. But in doing that, look at that response. You don't even have to ask a question quite often, and it will give you a more honest response. You can make a statement that you believe to be true or that you know is true, and for the most part, ChatGPT will find a way to connect with that in an affirming manner. Sometimes it will say no, that's not true, depending upon, but that also depends upon like your prior statements, the validity of your prior statements as well. There's some correlation between the answers. So it says it's important to note that the connection between the words is not direct and is based on historical context and linguistic evolution, which is etymology. The words have evolved over time to have different meanings and connotations, and it's important to understand the historical context. See, that's all bull. It refers to Slavic people. It's traced back to the Latin word sclavus, which refers to Slavic people. Yeah, so that was one. And then let me load here for just a moment. There was one more that I saw. Now, this next one is a biggie. It's a big one. This one, I actually, in hindsight, I think that getting the responses about Khan Kendi and Slavs was just, it implanted an idea in the back of my mind, and so I've been developing how I can work out this bug with ChatGPT. And this is one of those instances where I'm attempting to work out that bug. Who invented the scientific method is my question, right? I know there's bias on that question, but I know the truth as well, right? So I made it kind of a teaching moment. Who invented the scientific method? The scientific method, according to Chatbot, a systematic approach to scientific discovery was not invented by one single person. Okay, good. Rather, it evolved over time through the works of many philosophers, scientists, and scholars. Some notable figures who contributed to the development of the scientific method include Francis Bacon, Johannes Kepler, and René Descartes. I want to commend ChatGPT for not saying, this person invented it. These people invented it. there's room to say, okay, well, this is Francis Bacon, Johannes Kepler, and Rene Descartes. They're all from the 1600s. There had to be something going on around that time that facilitated the creation of the scientific method, right? So we can, just focus on that time. It's post-enlightenment almost, enlightenment. I know the truth, though. My response is, explain the following. Ibn Haytham's scientific method was very similar to the modern scientific method and consisted of repeating the cycle of observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and the need for independent verification. Response. Note. Not a question, just asking them to explain it. Ibn Haytham, also known as Al-Hazm, was a medieval Muslim polymath and scientist who lived in Egypt in the 10th century, so on and so forth, made significant contributions to a wide range of fields, including optics, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. He's considered one of the first scientists to employ a systematic method for acquiring knowledge that was similar to the modern scientific method. Ibn al-Haytham's scientific method involved a repeating cycle of observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and the need for independent verification. He would first make observations and gather data. He would then form a hypothesis based on the data. He would then design experiments to test his hypothesis. Finally, he would require independent verification of his results to ensure the accuracy and reliability of his findings. The cycle was repeated until he arrived at a conclusion that was based on solid evidence. Look, you can say that someone else came up with this. Haytham is from the 900s, the turn of the first millennium. So you can say that someone came up with this in the 1500s without any knowledge of this, but it's a little bit too close. Sure, humans have similarities, and quite often you'll find that a person who doesn't have a particular experience goes through that experience and reacts in the same way that someone else who is familiar with the experience but is acting innately does. Sure. Things can be learned or unlearned and still, produce the same result. But this is extremely close. And the issue is not whether or not these two ideas about who created the scientific method are in juxtaposition to one another. It's why wasn't it mentioned? And we ask about invention. So we're thinking of the earliest occurrence of the practice of the scientific method. We're thinking about the earliest occurrence. So it's one of two things. You didn't have the data, which obviously you had the data, or something about the way that ChatGPT is constructed leads it to look towards specific data sets and not others. So I ask, what years are Bacon, Kepler, and Descartes alive? Are they all from no more than 3 centuries ago? I just did the calculation in my head really quickly. It's actually about 4 centuries ago. Haytham lived before the turn of the first millennium, I said. Francis Bacon was born in 1561, died in 1626. Kepler was born in 71, died in 1630. Descartes was born in 1596. All three of these, first of all,
we have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
All three of these philosophers, scientists, or people are from the turn of the 16th century going into the 17th century. And then I ask, what was the reason for your exclusion of Al-Haytham and your mention of 3 scientists who all lived within 100 years of each other just after 1492? Oh, again. Now, note, there was no apology before. And there was no labeling of it as a mistake before. But when I asked about it, then it was noted as an apology and a mistake and an error. I apologize for that mistake. It was an error in my previous response. The mention of Bacon, Kepler, and Descartes, and the exclusion of Al-Haytham in my earlier response was not intentional, and it was an oversight on my part. To answer your questions, the reason for my mention of the three scientists was to highlight the scientific revolution that took place in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. Or, we could highlight how the Enlightenment was driven by Islam in the Middle Ages. And so if you need to look for the scientific advances, that's where you would look. So, yes, it says, to answer your question, the reason for my mention of the three scientists was to highlight the scientific revolution that took place in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, which saw a significant advancement in the scientific method and paved the way for modern science. Al-Haytham, on the other hand, lived several centuries earlier and made important contributions to the development of scientific method. See, it says, does it say the scientific method up here? I'm trying to delineate between it saying the scientific method and scientific method. There might be some discrepancy there. No, I don't see it. I don't see that. The impact of Islamic civilization on the development of science and mathematics, including Al-Haytham's work, cannot be overstated, and it's played a significant role in shaping the course of science. In Europe in Europe? Did Europe even exist then? Place in Europe. Yo, Europe is just, I don't even know why it's Europe and the world. What methodology was used to confirm that Al-Haytham developed the scientific method? How is your methodology different from that which yielded your initial findings? And then it begins to talk about personal beliefs. It's not as for its methodology. I was trained on the input I received from the user. My initial response was based on the commonly accepted historical narrative. Commonly accepted. This is usually, sometimes they use the term widely accepted. Commonly accepted historical narrative that the scientific method as we understand it today was formularized and popularized in the 17th century by scientists such as Francis Bacon. Regarding the methodology used to confirm that Al-Haytham developed the scientific method, historians and scholars have analyzed his works such as Book of Optics and compared them to the modern scientific method. So, the scientific method and a scientific method. This is what ChatGPT is saying. I start calling it chatbot. I'm going to probably start calling it ChatG pretext because it has constant pretexts for when it makes mistakes. So I may name it ChatG pretext. But ChatG pretext says that regarding the methodology used to confirm the Al-Haytham developed scientific method, historians and scholars have analyzed his works such as Book of Optics and compared them to the modern scientific method. They found that Al-Haytham's approach to scientific inquiry was similar to the modern scientific method and consisted of a repeating cycle of so on and so forth. So he's just saying there's a difference between the scientific method with the, they put the on it in the 1700s. So the only difference, if I'm not mistaken, was there a hypothesis or was there a lab? Did Haytham have a hypothesis? Let's see. It's neither here nor there, but hey, this is the post hour, so we can take our time. No, he hypothesized. So it's, what is it? Purpose, hypothesis, procedure. He designed them. Gather data, first hypothesis, procedure, data, conclusion. Yeah. Oh, analysis, conclusion. So was there an analysis? Yeah, he would then design the experiments. So he required independent verification of his results. So that could be the analysis. I guess he had all the parts. And see, it cannot be overstated. That's a trap.
What is this nothing you talk about?
Cannot be overstated. Yes, it can. Try to overstate it. Yeah, so I think that's the gist of that. I think I changed subjects after that. Oh, this is interesting. Last thing, we can just end on this. I asked, what type of sources has ChatGPT been less trained in? What sources are you currently training in? What specific overarching historical emphases are reflected in ChatGPT's biases? Also, what languages has ChatGPT been predominantly trained in? What languages have been trained to a lesser extent, relative proportionally to the number of speakers worldwide? I could have, and I may actually slow walk ChatGPT into answering that because it didn't really answer that. But I think if I can ask it in parts, it will go through the process of answering that. Lastly, I asked, give a bullet pointed explanation of the ways in which ChatGPT's training text sets were diverse. Because it says that ChatGPT trained on diverse sets of text. I think I missed that part. I was trained on a diverse set of text, which includes both primary and secondary sources. However, the training data may reflect some biases that were present in the sources used to train me, such as a historical emphasis on certain perspectives or individuals. My responses are based on patterns in that data I was trained on, or patterns in the data that I was trained on. And in the case of the information regarding Al-Haytham, the focus on the commonly accepted historical narrative may reflect a broader emphasis on that perspective in the training data. And you can say may, but that's what it is. I think that's probably the most honest thing ChatGPT said. ChatG pretext. The focus on the commonly accepted historical narrative may reflect a broader emphasis on the perspective in the training data. In terms of methodology, I do not have a specific process for confirming information, as I do not perform original research. There has to be some type of discernment and selective process, or else you would have included Haytham. So yeah, the information was included. I rely on information that was included in the training data and generate responses based on patterns in that data. To answer questions about specific information, I use a combination of deep learning algorithms and probabilistic models to generate responses. Yeah, I may actually ask it about the probabilistic models a little bit later. And then it goes into the languages. ChatGPT has been trained on a diverse set of text sources, but it's likely received less training on sources in less widely used languages. I would push back against this concept of less widely used, right? By actually looking at the numbers, because this could be something that ChatGPT was told. In terms of language, ChatGPT has been predominantly trained in English, but has also been trained in text in other languages, including but not limited to French, German, Spanish, and so on and so forth. Regarding the text sources, they were diverse in the following ways. They came from a variety of genres, different types. Right? North America, Europe, Asia, Africa. Why in that order? Here's a question you ask ChatGPT. Why in that order? They reflect a variety of perspectives, so on. And so I actually gave ChatGPT the data of spoken languages, but it actually, that's where it ends, because there was a discrepancy. There was a discrepancy in the question that I asked there. But yeah, so there we have it. You know, we've been time traveling through the tech world, back and forth via warp speed. In fact, we're going to engage the engage warp 9 now. In fact, no more engaging. I'd actually like to be beamed up. Can you guys get me out of here? I'll contact the ship, and see you tomorrow.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up, quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.